Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, if you're like most people today, you've probably had that feeling, that deep frustration of trying to have a serious conversation with someone whose political priorities or just their core experiences seem completely, utterly foreign to your own.
It feels impossible sometimes, like you're speaking different languages.
Exactly. It's like you can't even find the starting point to bridge that gap.
And that, I think, is the defining challenge of our fractured modern era. It reminds me of a puzzle Yuval Harari once posed, which is this deep philosophical but also cognitive problem.
Which is what exactly?
It's how can large-scale political dialogue, the very thing that makes a democracy actually function, how can that be viable if we fundamentally lack the psychological capacity to understand experiences we have never, ever lived through?
Right. It's not just about agreeing to disagree.
No, not at all. It's about truly internalizing the perspectives of millions of strangers. That's a whole different ballgame.
That is the perfect way to frame it. Because we live in a world where the number one complaint you hear is, they just don't get it. So the question isn't whether we should talk, but whether we are even mentally, structurally, and linguistically equipped to do it successfully across these massive, massive divides.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to explore the theoretical blueprint for achieving this empathetic translation of the unexperienced.
I like that phrase, empathetic translation.
And we're not just looking at, simple communication tactics. We are stacking sources that provide a really comprehensive, multi-layered framework. We're going to start with the political systems that are meant to contain the conflict.
Okay, the big picture stuff.
Exactly. Then we're drilling down, right down into the cognitive science of the individual brain, then the complexities of language, and finally, the social psychology of what makes us trust or distrust each other.
So it's like mapping the entire journey of a politically charged idea, from the institutional design of a government building all the way down to the firing of a single neuron in your head.
That's the plan. And we have to start structurally.
Right. Before we can look inside the mind, we need the right container. It makes sense. If the structure is fundamentally flawed, the conversation is doomed before the first word is even spoken.
It fails on launch. So part one is the institutional blueprint. We're examining how societies design these dialogue processes, specifically the ones that try to build a shared, sustainable future, moving way beyond just short-term conflict resolution.
Okay, so where do we start with that blueprint? What's the foundation?
The absolute bedrock of any political interaction, social contract theory.
Okay, so we're going back to the Enlightenment thinkers, but this isn't just a history lesson, right?
Not at all.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just a nod to Locke or Rousseau. It defines the very legitimacy required for dialogue to even begin. Well, the core concept, whether it's implicit or explicit, is that governance relies on mutual responsibilities. It's a two-way street.
Okay, break that down.
The individual, you, accepts the authority of the state, but in turn, the state has to guarantee certain protections, certain opportunities, a certain baseline of fairness.
And when a deep political conflict erupts?
It is, at its heart, a crisis of that contract. The agreement has fractured. One side, or maybe both, feels the other isn't holding up their end of the bargain.
So dialogue in that context becomes a tool for, what, recalibration?
Precisely. The process of political dialogue, seen through this lens, is mandated to redefine those mutual responsibilities. It's an act of participatory governance where all the key stakeholders have to contribute.
And not just to vent their frustrations.
No, not at all. They have to co-author the new terms of the contract.
I find that application of the theory so powerful. It really transforms what can seem like a simple, shouting match into an actual exercise in restoring trust.
It's essential for trust. The entire goal is to build or rebuild collaborative relationships. And we see the sharpest, most high-stakes application of this in transitional justice processes.
Okay, so give us an example. What does that look like?
Think of nations emerging from a brutal civil war or a long period of authoritarian rule. The dialogue there is basically performing a massive civic surgery.
Wow.
It has to manage both the backward-looking demands, historical accountability for past crimes, and the forward-looking urgency of designing a workable political future. You simply cannot design the future contract without first reckoning with why the old one failed so catastrophically.
That sets an incredibly high bar for success, but okay, what happens in a society where the divisions are so foundational, I'm thinking along ethnic or religious or linguistic lines, that people don't even agree on who belongs to the state in the first place?
That's a great question.
I mean, if your fundamental identity is the issue, social contract theory kind of struggles, doesn't it?
Yeah, It does. And that's when you need a different tool. You need the stabilizing mechanism of what's called consociationalism.
Consociationalism.
Uh-huh.
It sounds complex.
It is, but the idea is straightforward. It's basically political stabilization for societies that are pathologically fragmented. The theory, which is largely associated with a political scientist named Aaron Lichfart, operates on a very pragmatic assumption.
And what's that?
That these deep societal divisions are not going away anytime soon. So instead of trying to force unification, which could lead to more violence, you manage the conflict through structured elite-level power sharing.
So this sounds less like building a new consensus and more like building a very stable but still very divided house.
That's a great analogy.
What are the engineering principles here? How do you build that house?
There are 4 key design principles that you see again and again. First is the grand coalition government, meaning the leaders of all the significant segmented groups are guaranteed a place in the executive branch. They get a seat at the cabinet table. This ensures no major group feels permanently locked out of power.
Okay, so everyone's in the room. What's next?
Second, and this is critical, the mutual veto.
A veto for everyone. That sounds powerful, but also incredibly restrictive to actually governing.
It is. It guarantees that minority interests cannot simply be steamrolled by the majority on issues that are vital to their survival or identity. It's a powerful shield.
I can see how that would prevent the worst outcomes. What's the third principle?
The third is segmented autonomy. This allows different societal groups to manage their own internal affairs, things like their education systems, their cultural institutions, maybe even aspects of their family law.
So you minimize friction by letting them live under their own chosen rules to a degree.
To a degree, yes. And finally, number 4 is proportionality. This applies to resource allocations, civil service jobs, everything. It's all divided up based on the relative size of each group.
It sounds like an exquisitely engineered system for keeping the peace, I have to say. But I also have to push back a bit here, based on what our sources say. The central critique is that this system reinforces the very identity divisions it's trying to manage.
That is the perpetual dilemma. It's the big trade-off.
Right. I mean, if I know my political power is guaranteed only by maintaining my group's distinct identity, why would I ever seek integration? Why would I try to understand the needs of the other group? My incentive is to stay separate.
And that's the difficult truth the sources absolutely acknowledge. Consociationalism prevents civil war, which is a massive life-saving success. You can't discount that. But the critics argue it institutionalizes the us versus them mindset.
The boundaries become politically necessary.
They become reinforced by the very design of the state. And that makes Harari's goal of true empathetic translation much, much harder, because the identity barrier is constantly being rebuilt by the institutional structure. It stabilizes the conflict, but it doesn't resolve the conflict's deeper psychological roots.
Okay, so if consociationalism is about managing the surface structure, we need a theory that gets to the root disease. And that, I think, brings us to conflict transformation theory.
Exactly.
How does this go deeper than just standard conflict resolution?
Okay, so standard conflict resolution is usually transactional. It's about ending a surface-level dispute, right? Negotiating an immediate ceasefire, signing a treaty,
Putting out the fire.
putting out the immediate fire. Transformation theory, pioneered by people like John Paul Lederach, is fundamentally about changing the system. It seeks to systematically change the underlying structural causes, the entrenched inequality, the historical power imbalances, the marginalization that are the fuel for the conflict in the first place.
So we're not just stopping the fighting on the roof. We're redesigning the entire architecture of this society.
Precisely. And this requires 3 enormous shifts. First, a relationship reset.
What does that entail?
It means moving beyond just, tolerating your opponent to actually recognizing your mutual interdependence. The idea that we actually need each other to achieve something, whether it's economic stability or environmental safety or just peace.
Okay, so a relationship reset. What's the second shift?
Second is structural reform. This means putting institutional mechanisms in place specifically to alleviate the political and economic inequality that was driving the conflict. It's not enough to say you'll be fair. You have to build fairness into the system.
And the third part, the cultural shift. That seems like the hardest part of all.
It is essential for sustainability. It's the cultural shift. It's about moving from a deeply ingrained cultural acceptance of violent conflict resolution to one that prioritizes dialogue, negotiation, and coexistence.
So you're changing the default setting of the society.
Yes. Transformation theories aim to change the rules of the game so that future conflicts are naturally channeled into dialogue rather than violence.
This all sounds great for major historical conflicts. But let's bring it right up to the present day, to the kind of polarization we see online and in our politics. We see identity politics derail dialogue attempts all the time.
Constantly.
And that's where the dialogue sustainment theoretical model comes in. It seems like it was designed specifically for these highly polarized environments.
It's a crucial model for today because it offers an operating system for dialogue when the parties involved refuse to shed their identities. It complements these identity-based approaches by finding ways to keep the discussion going, regardless of how deep the disagreement is.
So how does it do that? How does it redefine the person we're talking to?
Well, it makes the actor dynamic rather than static. This is the first pillar.
Okay.
Instead of viewing citizens as these fixed, predefined identities, always this partisan, always that religious group, it sees them as worldview-based political actors.
With fluid, changing positions.
Exactly. This allows for movement. If you assume the identity is fixed and unchangeable, the conversation is already over before it starts.
And the second pillar, relational positionality. That seems to reinforce that idea of movement.
Absolutely. Relational positionality acknowledges that the opponent's stance is not only fluid, but it actually shifts based on the context of the interaction.
Oh, interesting. So my position might change depending on who I'm talking to.
Right. My position on an issue might be different if I'm talking to a community leader versus a government official versus a family member. The key insight for you, the listener, is that this immediately forces you to keep paying attention rather than just relying on a lazy, predetermined stereotype of your opponent.
That's a great point. If I assume you are just a fixed stereotype, I can mentally check out. I don't have to listen. But if I acknowledge your position is dynamic and relational, I have to actually engage.
You have to stay present.
What about the third pillar?
That's chronotopic boundaries. It's a fancy term.
It is.
But it just means it forces participants to consider how historical and cultural contexts, the past and the place, the chrono and the topic, influence the formation of the dialogue itself.
And this is its key contribution.
Yes. It allows dialogue to continue without requiring that we all assume identical identities. The dialogue itself becomes the negotiation of these shifting, context-dependent worldviews, rather than just a competition between two immovable objects.
Okay, so once these institutions are set up and people actually start talking, the communication is instantly filtered through framing. And framing can often override the facts themselves. Let's get into framing effects.
Framing is the essential psychological weapon and also the filter in any institutional dialogue. Identical facts, processed through different frames, can lead to completely opposite conclusions.
Can you give us a simple, clear example of how powerful this is?
Sure, let's think about tax policy. It's a classic. You can frame a tax cut as restoring freedom and stimulating prosperity. That's a positive economic liberty frame. Or you can frame that exact same tax cut as a massive subsidy for the wealthy at the expense of social stability. That's a moral or fairness frame. The data on the tax cut is the same in both cases, but the call to action, the emotional response, is entirely different.
So the choice of words literally dictates the reality we're arguing about.
It governs the perception of reality itself within the political arena. This is why metaphorical framing, like using the term illegal alien versus asylum seeker, is so powerful and so contested. Each term creates a different reality.
So for dialogue to actually be constructive, what does the framing strategy need to look like?
The research on this is pretty clear. Productive dialogue requires appealing to common, superordinate values through your framing. You have to find that common in-group identity that we'll talk about later, and then frame the issue in service of that shared identity.
But to defeat polarization, you need more.
You need to introduce the concept of frame exposure. To counteract echo chambers, you have to be exposed to multiple, diverse frames. If you only ever hear the tax cut equals freedom frame, your mind literally cannot process the information through the tax cut equals unfairness context. You lack the psychological tools to even see the alternative reality.
Okay, so to summarize part one, we've built the institutional shell. We have the foundational contract. We have a power-sharing mechanism for divided societies, a process for structural reform, and a model for dealing with hyperpolarization through tracking dynamic worldviews.
The stage is set.
The stage is set. But as you said, the structure only gets us so far. Now, we have to turn to the incredible complexity of the individual human engine that's supposed to operate within that structure.
Yes. And this is part two, the individual engine. To successfully address Harari's challenge, understanding the unexperienced, our brains have to execute this really complex cognitive process we're calling empathetic translation.
And this requires some very sophisticated biological and psychological systems working together.
In perfect concert, ideally.
I think most people assume empathy is just, one thing. You either have it or you don't. But our sources break it down into multiple distinct functions that are actually mapped to different parts of the brain. Let's start with theory of mind, or TOM.
TOM is the absolute foundational ability. You can't do anything else without it. It's the capacity to understand that other people possess beliefs, desires, intentions, and emotions that are distinct from and potentially contradictory to your own.
That's the crucial leap, isn't it? Recognizing that the person across the table is running a different operating system than you are.
It is everything. And during a deep political conversation, what Tom is actually doing is it's acting as the engine of simulation and inference.
What do you mean by simulation?
Well, if a political group acts in a way that seems completely irrational or even hostile to you, Tom allows you to simulate their judgment and their feelings. You can infer their behavior based on their different beliefs or their historical trauma or the information they have access to. It allows you to say, okay, I profoundly disagree with their solution, but I think I understand why they arrived at that belief structure.
And we know where the simulation engine is located in the brain.
We have a pretty good idea. It's associated with a specific network. The medial prefrontal cortex, which is heavily involved in social cognition, the posterior superior temporal sulcus, or PSTS, and the temporoparietal junction, the TPJ.
The TPJ. I've heard that described as the brain's GPS for other people's minds.
That's a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
It plots their location in ideological or emotional space, allowing you to track their perspective relative to your own.
The classic illustration of this, of course, is the Sally Ann test.
Right. It's a perfect, simple illustration. A child demonstrates they have theory of mind when they can understand that Sally thinks her doll is in the basket, even though the child watched Anne move it to the box.
Because they can hold Sally's false belief in their mind separately from their own knowledge of the truth.
Exactly. And in political dialogue, this is the capacity to understand my opponent genuinely believes the economy is collapsing, and therefore their support for this drastic policy is rational from their perspective, even if all my data suggests the economy is fine.
So Tom allows us to think like them. But that's a cold cognitive process. We still need the emotional fire, which is where effective empathy comes in.
Yes, effective empathy is the ability to intuitively feel and emotionally respond, along with another person's feelings. If you see someone weeping over a loss, you feel a pang of sorrow, even if you never met the person they lost. This is the emotional resonance that turns abstract data into urgent action.
And neuroscientifically, this looks very different from theory of mind.
It does. It lights up different areas. Effective empathy is linked to the insula, the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC, and the amygdala. These are structures that are deeply associated with processing our immediate, visceral emotional experiences and our internal body states.
And why is that so politically vital?
Because if I cannot emotionally register the real felt distress caused by, say, systemic racism or pervasive poverty, I can't truly internalize the political demands that arise from those experiences.
Yep.
I'm only processing abstract facts, not actual human suffering. The motivation to act isn't there.
This moves us into what I think is the most fascinating hardware component of all, the mirror neuron system. This feels like a biological shortcut for immediate, nonverbal understanding.
It really is the instantaneous bridge. It was discovered by Rizzolatti's team back in the 1990s, and the mechanism is just revolutionary. When you observe someone performing an action, specific neurons in your brain fire as if you were performing that action yourself.
So if I watch someone on screen experience a sudden shock, my brain's shock response pathways actually activate, even though I'm perfectly safe in my chair.
Absolutely. This connects the observation of external behavior or emotion directly to an internal, non-experienced understanding. It bypasses the need for complex rational simulation.
So it's more primitive.
It's more immediate. It provides an intuitive behavioral emotional understanding. When someone from an utterly different background describes their struggle, their fear, their joy, the mirror system gives you a little internal bodily echo of that struggle. It's the neurological basis for that deep feeling that we are fundamentally the same species.
With this capacity, like any muscle, it needs practice, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, it atrophies. And that's why we transition to narrative simulation theory. We train our empathy through stories.
This theory is so profound because it links culture directly to our cognitive abilities. It argues that we possess the ability to actively simulate entire stories or narratives of other people's lives in order to understand
So it's
them.
not passive consumption.
No, it's active simulation. Indirect exposure to diverse, complex lives, whether it's through great literature, film, history, or detailed personal testimony, it cultivates and strengthens our capacity for large-scale perspective taking.
So reading a detailed novel about the life of, say, a migrant worker isn't just entertainment. It's actually cognitive training for empathetic translation.
That's exactly right. And the evidence supports this. Studies consistently show that frequent readers of narrative fiction score significantly higher on theory of mind tests.
That's fascinating.
Fiction acts as this massive, low-risk mental sandbox where you can practice inhabiting thousands of different intentional and emotional states. To understand the political realities of a person completely unlike you, your brain has to have exercised this narrative muscle over and over again. If your cultural intake only ever confirms your own existing story, this vital cognitive muscle just wastes away.
Okay, so our internal hardware is sophisticated. But what shared external infrastructure do we need to facilitate this connection across a whole society?
Well, we need shared systems. The first and most obvious is a shared language with shared metaphors and symbolic systems. If we don't even use the same words to describe reality, the internal simulation is going to fail.
And beyond language.
Second, cultural narratives. Things like national epics, shared civic ideologies, or even widely accepted myths that create a sense of communal emotion among total strangers.
These are the shared stories that make strangers feel like neighbors.
Exactly. And finally, and this is so important today, institutional trust.
Meaning?
Meaning, if I have never met you, how do I know your story is credible? Well, I can still deem your experience credible indirectly if that information is filtered and communicated through trusted third-party institutions like reliable media, verified scientific research, or an education system that is seen as impartial. If trust in those institutions collapses, then the vast majority of unexperienced information becomes politically meaningless. It's just noise.
And that sets the stage perfectly for part 3. We have the political structure, we have the neurological engine, but the bridge between them is language itself. If we don't have the sophisticated tools to articulate difference, all the empathy in the world can't successfully cross that divide.
Language is the ultimate vehicle for that empathetic translation, and it requires high-level linguistic and pragmatic structures that can handle immense subtlety and complexity.
Okay, let's start with the fundamental engineering of language itself, what our sources call the duality of patterning and grammatical precision.
Right. This is an insight from the linguist Charles Hockett. The idea is that language is built on meaningless sounds phones that combine into meaningful units, words, sentences. This system allows for infinite generativity and immense precision, and for high-level political dialogue, that precision is completely non-negotiable.
Why is grammatical precision so vital to a political exchange?
Because politics rarely deals with simple, unambiguous objects. It requires articulating very subtle differences in context, in positioning, in historical causality. If we lack the grammatical precision to differentiate between, say, I disagree with the process by which this policy was created, and I disagree with the outcome of this policy, the whole negotiation just collapses into a muddy mess.
You have to be able to articulate nuance.
You must, and that requires precise syntax and grammar. This feeds directly into the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is the idea that the language we use actively influences, or maybe even structures, our thought patterns.
Right. So if the language you use lacks the tools to describe a certain reality, that reality might become, in a way, cognitively inaccessible.
That's the strong version of the hypothesis. But even the weaker version suggests that the presence or absence of linguistic structures for expressing nuance is critical for this empathetic translation we're talking about.
And this is where cultural translation becomes so difficult. Our sources mention the Korean term dapdathada.
Yes. That term is so much more than just frustration. It describes a specific, almost suffocating emotional state of being trapped by external circumstances, often involving systemic or bureaucratic barriers that you can't push through. It takes a whole paragraph to even begin to convey that in English.
And that's a problem for dialogue.
It's a huge problem. If large-scale dialogue requires recognizing and responding to a person's deepest sense of injustice, but your shared language lacks the precision to convey that nuanced emotional reality, how can a policymaker possibly address the root cause of that suffocation? Refined emotional sharing requires understanding and translating these diverse linguistic structures.
So we need precise words, but often the real meaning of a political statement is implicit. It's not in the words themselves. This requires what's called pragmatic inference.
This is the critical skill of reading between the lines. It's about inferring intentions and implied meanings from context. A philosopher named Grice laid out what he called the cooperative principle, which are the ground rules for conversation.
What are they?
We basically assume the speaker adheres to maxims of quality, quantity, relevance, and manner. We expect them to be truthful, to give the right amount of information, to be relevant, and to be clear.
But political speech constantly violates these maxims, right? I mean, especially with things like satire, indirect speech, highly charged metaphors.
All the time. Which is why high-level inference is demanded of the listener. When a politician uses indirect speech to criticize an opponent without getting hit with a defamation charge, the listener has to correctly infer the specific intended meaning. If the listener lacks those high pragmatic skills, they might misinterpret the metaphor literally or just miss the subtle critique entirely.
And when that happens, the shared meaning evaporates.
It evaporates, and dialogue becomes dangerous because people stop understanding the intended implications of the message. They start reacting to different interpretations of the same words.
And to even start a conversation, we need the basic belief that we are, in fact, talking about the same thing. We need joint attention.
Michael Tomasello's work really emphasizes this necessity. Joint attention is the ability of two or more individuals to focus on the same object or topic and share a common understanding of its meaning. It's the absolute fundamental building block of political discussion.
So if two groups are arguing about justice, for example.
Right. If one group defines justice as fair distribution of wealth, and the other defines it as punishment for moral transgression, they are not actually discussing the same concept.
And in that scenario, disagreement doesn't lead to a healthy debate. It just instantly turns into incomprehensible conflict because they're arguing about what the problem is, not the solution.
Precisely. And in these high-stakes dialogues, we also have to recognize that language is not neutral. It is a powerful tool for imposing ideology, which brings us to discourse analysis.
Thinkers like Fairclough and Van Dyke argued that language is a tool for producing power and identity within a social context. It's not just a passive carrier of information.
And this applies directly to what we're talking about. Analyzing the vocabulary, the syntax, the recurrent topic framing, it's essential because these elements determine the acceptability and the direction of the communication. If one political faction consistently uses language that dehumanizes an outgroup, that language is actively producing an ideology that makes empathetic dialogue with that group virtually impossible. The language itself creates the power imbalance.
So the conscious choices made in political rhetoric are not just stylistic flourishes. They are structurally dictating the terms of engagement. How do we move towards synchronization after navigating all these linguistic traps?
Well, we seem to rely on something called the interactive alignment model.
What's that?
Pickering and Garrett proposed that during a conversation, people automatically and often unconsciously align or synchronize their linguistic features, their grammar, their vocabulary, their semantics, and even their body posture and speech rate.
It's that subconscious desire to linguistically mirror the other person.
It is. And when people from profoundly different backgrounds start to align on common words and frames in a political dialogue, that process acts like a social lubricant. This alignment is an unconscious mechanism that builds trust and familiarity. It reduces the cognitive load, and it paves the way for the really difficult work of empathetic translation.
So if we start sounding a little bit more like each other, we feel a little bit more comfortable engaging with each other's ideas.
It's a start.
Okay? We've built the institutional container, we've secured the linguistic bridge, and we've identified the cognitive tools. But the entire enterprise is still incredibly fragile because of one thing: deep-seated psychological defensiveness. All these mechanisms fail if the participants are operating on the assumption that the person across the table is their enemy.
That is the ultimate hard wall. And that's what Part 4 tackles, the psychological barriers. The core insight here is that dialogue only truly opens up when the us versus them mindset is significantly lowered.
Let's unpack the theoretical bedrock of that division: in-group bias and social identity theory, pioneered by Toshville and Turner.
The premise is remarkably simple, but incredibly powerful. Humans instinctively categorize themselves into in-groups, that's us, and out-groups, that's them. And we automatically show favor toward our in-group and, often, suspicion or hostility toward the out-group. This is deeply evolutionary, and it's tied to our survival instincts.
The political implication of that is just paralyzing. If I perceive someone, a member of the opposing party, a different social class, a rival identity. As an outgroup member, I engage in what's called defensive processing.
Which means the information they present is instantly filtered as suspect or rejected outright, regardless of its factual basis. Your brain is protecting your group identity first and seeking truth second.
The famous minimal group experiments, like the Klee versus Kandinsky groups, they make this so visceral.
They're stunning. Researchers would randomly assign subjects to groups based on completely trivial, absurd criteria like whether they said they preferred one abstract painter over another.
And even in those totally arbitrary groups.
Even there, participants quickly exhibited in-group preference. They would allocate more resources to the person who shared their trivial preference, and they showed active discrimination toward the outgroup. If a preference for an abstract painting can trigger discrimination, just imagine what happens with deeply felt historical, economic, or religious divides.
It tells us that the psychological trigger for rejection is almost flimsy, yet the response is incredibly powerful.
It is. We have this instinctual drive to reject the outgroup, but luckily it's counterbalanced by an equally powerful instinctual drive to form bonds, and that is the need to belong.
Okay.
Baumeister and Leary formalize this. It's a strong instinctual drive in all humans to form and maintain stable, positive social relationships. It's evolutionary. We survive better in groups.
So what's the practical application for conflict?
Successful mediation must first establish the message, we belong to the same community, or at least we share a common fate. That has to come first before the door to rational, empathetic dialogue can be forced open. The fear of exclusion can be leveraged to drive re-inclusion.
The environment itself also drastically affects how we process information. If the environment is hostile, we switch from measured thought to immediate emotional response, which brings us to hot and cold cognition.
Right. Cold cognition is your rational, systematic, slow processing. Ideally, it's unbiased. Hot cognition is fast, immediate information filtered through emotion. It's designed for threat response, but it is highly prone to distortion and confirmation bias.
So in a highly polarized, hostile political environment, what happens in our brains?
The opponent's words are immediately filtered through the hot, emotional bias. The brain prioritizes survival and defense. Everything they say is easily misinterpreted as an adversarial intent or a direct threat, even if the explicit language is neutral or even conciliatory.
So that emotional filter sabotages any chance for empathy.
It does, because the words themselves are instantly weaponized. A sincere offer of negotiation can sound like a trap to a brain operating in hot cognition mode. So how do we actively dismantle that hot cognition filter? How do we change the categorization from them to us? The theoretical antidote here is the common in-group identity model.
This is a direct strategic solution. It was proposed by Gartner and Davidio to lower the walls created by social identity theory. The strategy is to reduce discrimination and hostility by actively restructuring the perception of the outgroup into an overarching shared superordinate group.
It's all about reframing the conversation from two opposing sides to two parts of a greater whole.
Exactly. The key is finding that larger umbrella identity that can encompass both parties. You shift the discussion from your party versus my party to we are all citizens of this state facing an economic collapse, or we are all parents concerned about the future generation.
You reframe the other as an expanded in-group member.
And that increases trust and acceptance. It neutralizes the defensive processing and makes true dialogue possible where it was previously blocked by identity. It's a cognitive trick, but it has powerful real-world results. And finally, what sustains this reframed cooperation over time? That would be interdependence and shared goals.
Yes, Kelly and Thibault's work confirms this. Cooperation is maximized when people recognize that their survival and their prosperity are fundamentally linked.
A shared fate.
A shared fate. If a society faces an existential threat, a common external enemy, a massive environmental catastrophe, a crippling economic crisis, that recognition creates a powerful common objective. The feeling that we absolutely must understand each other to survive this crisis can override immediate hostility and provides the necessary practical incentive for dialogue to persist.
Okay, so we've established the institutional framework, the cognitive engine, the linguistic bridge, and the necessary psychological preconditions for lowering hostility. But we have yet to address the deepest level of connection that's required for truly transformative change.
Right.
Part 5 seems to move beyond basic empathy into actually blurring the line between self and other.
This is where the philosophy meets the practical psychology of communication, shared reality, and self-extension. We need to move past simply tolerating your existence to feeling that your experience is, in some way, part of my own. This is how Harari's challenge truly becomes manageable.
Let's start with extended self theory. How does the concept of self move beyond my biological body and connect to a political opponent?
Well, thinkers like William James and Ulrich Neisser argued that the self isn't just your skin and bones. It extends to include your possessions, your memories, your language, and crucially, the groups and the people you are deeply connected to.
The implication for dialogue is huge.
It is. It means genuine empathetic dialogue requires recognizing the political opponent as, in some way, an extended self. If I understand that your trauma, your pain, and your perspective are inextricably linked to my community's stability, that my well-being is dependent on yours, then understanding the unexperienced becomes a necessary act of self-preservation, not just a detached intellectual exercise.
It changes the motive from curiosity to necessity. And this blurring of the boundary between self and other leads directly into shared reality theory. What is the mechanism of this shared reality?
Echterhoff and Higgins found that the deepest emotional and informational exchange only occurs when individuals feel they're sharing the exact same reality. It's not enough to agree on the facts or even the logical deduction from those facts. You have to achieve alignment on the emotional and psychological interpretation of those facts.
So if we look at the same data about climate change, and one of us sees an opportunity for green tech growth, and the other sees existential doom, we have not achieved a shared reality, even if we agree on the parts per million of CO2.
Precisely. Trust and empathy are significantly boosted only when participants share those emotional responses and perceptions, that feeling of we're seeing the same thing and interpreting it with the same emotional consequences. If one side sees data as a triumph and the other sees it as a catastrophe, dialogue fails because they're inhabiting two different worlds of consequence.
Taking that one step further, we arrive at intersubjectivity. This sounds like the deepest philosophical level of understanding.
It is. Thinkers like Merleau-Ponty and Daniel Stern suggest that mutual understanding is formed not just through discussion, but through a shared world and joint action, which we learn from our most basic human interactions, like a mother and an infant gazing at the same toy.
What's the deep implication there?
It means dialogue is not merely an exchange of preformed opinions. It is a profound, active process of co-creating meaning about the world itself.
So we aren't just describing our realities to each other. We are collaboratively building a single new reality that we both can occupy.
And if you're going to co-create meaning, you have to constantly manage the linguistic architecture you bring to the table, which cycles us right back to a more refined framing theory.
Goffman and Lakoff showed that differing frames inevitably lead to communication collisions. For instance, if one side frames all political action as a game or a competition to be won, and the other frames it as a moral crusade.
The actionable step here for deep dialogue is what you could call frame negotiation. You have to consciously recognize, respect, and negotiate the terms of the opposing frame before the discussion even begins. Successful dialogue means both sides can articulate the opposition's fundamental frame clearly and respectfully, even if they completely reject that framework. Without that negotiation, the co-creation of meaning is impossible.
Let's bring in the final cognitive elements that govern how we accept information from others. First, the cognitive similarity hypothesis.
This hypothesis posits that people better understand and accept words and narratives from those who share similar cognitive styles, emotional systems, or life experiences. Crucially, even indirect experiences are deemed more trustworthy if the person telling the story seems to share similar values or problem sets to your own.
This explains why relatability is such a powerful tool in political communication.
It's everything. If I see myself in the person speaking, their story feels more real and more trustworthy.
And if they feel psychologically distant, the opposite happens. This is construal level theory.
Right. Trope and Lieberman found that when someone is felt to be psychologically close, part of your tribe, in your city, information is processed concretely and emotionally. This enables empathy and visceral understanding. But when they are distant, abstract, foreign, other, it is processed abstractly and schematically.
As a statistic, as an anonymous number, not a human life.
Exactly. Political dialogue must actively work to reduce that psychological distance to enable high empathy. It has to move the discussion from abstract ideology to concrete, relatable human reality.
Finally, let's end with a stark look at the purpose of this entire system, the evolutionary psychology of cooperation. Why did dialogue even evolve in the first place?
Well, researchers like Tomasello and Orty argue that language and cooperation evolved not primarily to seek some abstract philosophical truth.
Which is what we often think it's for.
Right. They argue it evolved to facilitate group survival and collaboration toward shared goals.
That's a pretty sobering conclusion for political discourse today, isn't it?
It is. It reminds us that dialogue remains viable only if a common superordinate objective exists. If the dialogue loses its purpose, if the participants don't feel they need to understand each other to solve a looming crisis, the conversation tends to fragment and fail. It underscores the practical, evolutionary imperative behind successful communication. Without the shared goal of survival, this whole sophisticated system of dialogue just breaks down.
Wow. This has mapped the entire theoretical terrain required for understanding an unexperienced perspective. It's truly a complex, integrated system, far more intricate than just telling people to be nicer to each other. Let's try to synthesize the necessary blueprint we have uncovered.
Well, to succeed, large-scale political dialogue requires that integrated network we described. Institutionally, you need structured mechanisms like conflict transformation and the dialogue sustainment model to manage power and keep the conversation fluid and continuous, even with deep polarization.
And then cognitively, you need these highly specialized internal mechanisms. Theory of mind to simulate intentions, affective empathy to feel the pain, and the mirror neuron system to intuitively grasp the action. And all of this is trained and strengthened by narrative simulation, by exposure to diverse stories.
Then linguistically, you need the precise tools. Duality of patterning for nuance, high-level pragmatic inference to navigate all the subtext, and mechanisms like interactive alignment to achieve that shared verbal synchronization.
And crucially, the psychological precondition is the active demolition of hostility. This requires overriding our natural in-group bias, appealing to the fundamental need to belong, and successfully reframing the them as an expanded us using the common in-group identity model.
And the ultimate success, that transformative stage, requires tearing down the self-other boundary. It means applying extended self-theory, co-creating meaning through intersubjectivity, constantly negotiating opposing frames, and always focusing the conversation toward a collective, shared, and necessary objective. Without that entire integrated system firing on all cylinders, the empathetic translation of the unexperienced simply breaks down.
It really makes you appreciate that every single political conversation you have requires the successful simultaneous functioning of philosophy, neuroscience, and social psychology. The success of large-scale political dialogue hinges on our ability to cognitively and emotionally translate the experiences of those we do not know. So here's the provocative thought we want to leave you with.
If the entire success of this complex enterprise hinges on our capacity for narrative simulation, our ability to train our empathy by simulating lives different from our own, often through fiction and testimony, what systemic, cultural, or educational practice is most urgently required today to build and strengthen that narrative simulation capacity across society, making us all better equipped for political life tomorrow?
Think about that question and the stories you consume as you navigate your own political landscape this week. We'll see you next time for the next Deep Dive.